All right, welcome everybody to a beautiful Wednesday. It's April 22nd. It's Earth Day in Minnesota here today, so I got to make sure we call that out. It's a kind of a special day. A lot of Minnesotans love to get outside and do something special for Earth Day. So today we're going to talk a little bit about um, fishing in Minnesota. So I think with that, Shannon, I'm just going to turn it over to you. We're going to talk about native rough fish management today. Shannon Fisher is our fisheries populations monitoring staff, and I'm going to let you finish introducing yourself, Shannon, and go on with your presentation.
All right, thank you, Benji. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you here today, and I'm going to start off by just letting you know I've been with the state of Minnesota working on fisheries and natural resource issues since the spring of 2000, so almost 26 years. And it's great because people ask me, what's so great about, the job that I do, and my response is usually that I don't mind getting up for it every day, and what a great opportunity that is. And so I'm pleased to just share some information with you today. Minnesota has between 160 and 164 species of fish, which is quite a few. 141 of those species are native to the state. They've always been here, and we hope they always will be. Of those 141 native species, the minnow family, or what's called the Cyprinidae, includes 48 species. But today, what we're going to be primarily focusing on is a group of fish known as native rough fish, and how the management of these species is changing in Minnesota. But before we go into that, we need to talk about kind of where the term rough fish comes from. The term rough fish was based on how certain species of fish used to be processed during the commercial harvest. So you'd have a commercial fisherman who would go out and capture, let's just say 1,000 fish, and they would have limited time before the fish would spoil, or they would get back to the dock or to the market. And so those that had the greatest value in terms of resale value would be processed wholly, they'd be filleted out. Those that had lesser value would be maybe gutted or just sold whole or in the round or in the rough. And so that's where the term rough fish comes from. It was certain species that were deemed as of lesser value, at least commercially. As a result of that, we have some historical rough fish perceptions that are a little troubling. Fish species have often been perceived, the rough fish species, by both anglers and unfortunately by the agencies themselves, as having limited value to the sport fishery particularly. But these things change over time. We've got a number of pictures here of different species, and over on the right-hand side, we have burbot, and we have lake whitefish and cisco, and we have catfish, or in this particular case, flathead catfish. These were also deemed for many years as rough fish, or as fish of little value, unfortunately oftentimes deemed as trash fish. But these things have changed over time, and the species are getting more recognition for for what they are and what they contribute. But if we think about the historical rough fish perceptions, there are kind of a few things that go along with these kind of older thought processes. One is that they all have aquatic habitat degradation potential, that these fish are bad for the environment. There's also the perception that they compete with desirable species, that they have low to no ecosystem value, and that they have no cultural value. The picture there on the bottom left is a group of young spearers that were on, I believe, the Minnesota River. That is about 80 gar that were harvested, and it caused a little bit of an uproar. People didn't like this, and so that was what led to a movement in many ways in Minnesota to kind of change the way these fish are perceived. The other problem is that on that picture on the right is a group of native fish. There are no carp in that picture, even though some of them look a little gold and carpy looking. Those are actually high fin carp suckers or quillbacks. There's some buffalo in that picture. And so when we talk about these kind of perceptions and things like aquatic habitat degradation, low to no ecosystem value, what we're really probably talking about are common carp. And the carp is not a native rough fish. They are in fact an invasive, and they are the ones that are causing a majority of the problems, or nearly all of the problems that are oftentimes blamed on rough fish in general. And so we want to make a distinction between common carp and the native rough fish. So what are some of the realities of the native rough fish? Um, for decades, if not over a century, there has been a concerted effort to remove native rough fish from waterways, thinking that it was going to benefit other species, and that just never really came to fruition. Native fish removals rarely deliver intended benefits. The other thing here is no substantive evidence that native rough fish reduce or significantly impact game fish populations. There just isn't a lot of evidence to support that. Although there is a lot of perception out there, or a lot of belief that getting rid of these fish is a good thing. Many native rough fish do have some critical ecosystem services that they deliver as part of their life cycle. You know, for example, if you think about the young from these species, they can be very important prey resources for predator game fish. The other thing that is also a very important point to make here is that there's a number of these species that have a relationship with native mussels. And so there's a cycle in which the mussels, have a larval phase that has to implant in a fish gill in order to survive. And some of these native rough fish are really important in that regard. And one of the things that we're realizing more and more is that there are many user groups that do care about the future of native rough fish populations. We have a very active bow fishing group in the state. There's a lot of anglers in the state. There's just a lot of conservationists who believe in protecting these species, and so there is a lot of interest in these species. So for about the last 6 or 7 years, the DNR has been talking about these species, kind of roughing out what should we be doing. But in 2023, we put out a questionnaire. We got about 600 responses, and two points kind of surfaced that I thought were very interesting. One was that about 91% of the respondents said that native rough fish are critically important to lake and stream ecology. That was one of the first times that we actually had a majority of people that we talked to that said, hey, we understand that these fish are important. What was also interesting is about 79% said that they believed the regulations are needed to protect native rough fish, and that was also kind of new. So we've been trying to work on, various mechanisms here to try to elevate these species. We have the "Don't Kill and Dump Rough Fish" ad that we put in the regulations book. There's a popular perception out there that you're not allowed to to put native rough fish back into the water, and that's just simply not true. Um, the other part here is that in 2022, we actually put a red horse sucker on the front of the regs book, which stirred some conversation. Some people loved it. Some people thought it was a travesty. But nonetheless, it got people talking about native rough fish. There has been some legislative work being done. It's been going on, almost 7 years now. In 2019, Cisco, lake whitefish, and burbot were removed from the rough fish list and moved to the game fish list. In 2022, largely in response to that spearing of 80 some gar, the DNR was asked by the legislature to establish a statewide bag limit for gar, which we did. And then in 2023, the DNR produced a legislative report on native fish conservation, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I just want to emphasize that, we can't do these efforts without good partners and people who are interested in conserving these fish. And so I want to give some recognition to the Isaac Walton League, a group called Native Fish for Tomorrow, and the Minnesota Conservation Federation, as well as the Nature Conservancy, for really advocating and promoting the importance of these fish, and it's made a difference. So the legislative report included 4 recommendations: provide more education about native rough fish, increase environmental restoration efforts that benefit native rough fish, hire specialized staff to advance native rough fish initiatives, and conduct more research on native rough fish. And just a few highlights about, kind of what have we been doing, on each of these recommendations. The first one on providing more education. Since 2025, we have been doing a Minnesota native fish calendar. These calendars appear to be very wildly popular. We bring them to the state fair, we bring them to events, and people ask for them. They seem to really enjoy them. Um, we've been very active in promoting native fish on our social media accounts. We've had more than 30 social media touches on native fish. And another thing that we did was, we modified our state record fish program to include more catch and release options. So for example, we have a lot of people who fish for bigmouth buffalo or blue suckers or shovel-nosed sturgeon or gar, for example, and they don't necessarily want to kill one of these fish to have it registered as a potential state record. So we open those up to catch and release options, and that's been pretty popular for us. The second one is increase environmental restoration efforts that benefit native rough fish. Uh, the state of Minnesota is active in trying to improve migration routes, for example. There's an example here of the Pelican Rapids Rock Arch Rapids project. You can see the before restoration where it's obviously a fish barrier. Nothing's going to probably get through there. And then you can see the after restoration, which is a rock arch rapids, which allows for fish migration and movement. And down at the bottom of that page, or on the right side there, you can see some of the species that were photographed utilizing that rock rapids. There was walleyes, white suckers, lake sturgeon, among a variety of other species. And so these connections can make a huge difference in terms of the ability of these fish to thrive and prosper. The other recommendation, or the third recommendation, was hire a specialized staff to advance native rough fish initiatives. And so we hired Brett Nagel, who is our native fish biologist, and you can see him there with a couple of red horse that he sampled. And the intent here is, and the legislature actually provided us with money for this position. The intent here is to have that individual, advocating and promoting for native rough fish in these other areas, and doing what they can to promote and advance the species. And the fourth one is conduct more research on native rough fish. I'm particularly proud of some of the work that we have been doing here. I was involved with a study done by the Bemidji State University graduate student, Griffin Bledgen up there, who did a great job looking at bowfin across 3 lakes in Minnesota. And we just learned an immense amount. I mean, it exponentially increased our knowledge of bowfin in the state of Minnesota. We also have Devin Oliver, one of our researchers down in the southeast on the Mississippi, primarily working on things like gar and sucker genetics and red horse genetics. And it's really, we're seeing some really good information come in, and these things are only going to help us manage these species better as we go. But the legislative work on rough fish was not done. In 2024, we brought forward to the legislature a request to change the rough fish definition. And the reason is that carp are blended in with things like buffalo and bowfin and gar and drum. And it's really problematic because we don't want to associate carp with the native rough fish. They're 2 very different creatures. And so what we asked was to get the carp piece out of the rough fish definition and then change the rough fish definition to native rough fish. This was ultimately approved. And what it did was it changed 55 different language adjustments in statute. 31 of those were just simply changing rough fish to native rough fish to guarantee permissive use. But 24 of those adjustments modified management of and/or provided new protections for native rough fish that previously only applied to game fish. So this was a huge step for us because it allowed us to to really think about native fish, native rough fish as a group of fish that have value, and separate them out from the carp. I don't expect you to read this big long explanation here, but this is the actual definition for native rough fish, and it lists out 26 different species that we consider native rough fish. And I'm going to go through those here just to give you a little bit of some background on the species that we have. There are two species in Minnesota. There's the short-nosed gar and the long-nosed gar. And you can see that what you've got in on most of these slides that I'm going to go through, there's a map of Minnesota with a series of dots that just simply show where these fish have been observed. The white dots are observations that have been recorded by field staff, for example. The red dots are what we call verified observations, where someone from, say, like the Bell Museum or some other entity has verified that that is in fact what we were talking about. So anyways, this is the, I believe, the long-nosed gar map. You can see that we've got some populations that are primarily in the lower Mississippi, the portions of the lower St. Croix, and then the Minnesota River. Also, there's a few down in that southwest corner of the state, which is the Missouri River drainage. And a few other populations, but it's primarily the lower Mississippi and Minnesota River. These fish like backwater habitats. They have an affinity for vegetation, primarily because they can sneak up in the vegetation and find food resources. Long-nosed gar, like the one in the picture on the left, can get up to 36 inches long. These fish can readily live for 20 plus years. And one of the interesting parts about them is that they can breathe air. And so if they're in a habitat that is oxygen poor, they can actually come up and gulp air and survive in that way. Now, one thing that's really cool about the gar, along with the bowfin, is that these are an ancient species. They've got what's called ganoid scales. They're very, very tough, rigid scale. And they've been around, since the time of the dinosaurs, literally. And they're a cool fish, and they are catchable. Got to have the right tackle for them, but people catch them, and they are a predator species and eat a lot of small cyprinids, minnows, small sunfish. They also like frogs and other things. So anyway, so that's the gars. The next group is the buffaloes. We have three species of buffalo in Minnesota. There's the bigmouth buffalo, smallmouth buffalo, and the black buffalo. The black buffalo are relatively rare in Minnesota. There are a few around in the southern part of the state, but they are not nearly as abundant as the smallmouth or bigmouth buffalo. The map that I've got here is the bigmouth buffalo distribution. You can see again lakes, and in this case rivers and lakes. If a lake is attached to a river, buffalo might find their way in there. They're found in the lower Mississippi. They're found in the Minnesota River, the Missouri River drainage, and they're also found, bigmouth are also found in the Red River drainage, and they're also found in the upper Mississippi drainage as well. They're oftentimes confused with carp. It's very common for me to hear people refer to them as buffalo carp, which is not what they should be called. They are buffalo. They are not a carp, and they do not have the damage. They do not cause the damage that common carp do. What we have a researcher, Alec Lackman, up at the University of Minnesota Duluth, who has been studying these fish and has found that in some populations, these fish can reach 100 plus years old. They can get to up to 40 pounds, so they can get very large. And one thing to note is that as you move north, not counting the Red River Basin, but if you move north in the Mississippi River Basin, some of these populations are really struggling. They are very large size structured, so there's only very large old individuals left. And in some cases, we've not documented any reproduction for more than 50 years. And so we are watching some of these populations carefully. But they are still a very common species in the south. They grow much faster, they reproduce more regularly, and they're an important commercial species for some of our commercial fishermen. Freshwater drum, also a riverine species, but they will be found in some lakes. They're a relatively common species where they're found. They are found in southern and western Minnesota, locally called sheephead. A lot of people will call them that. These can also get quite old. There's reports of them reaching over 60 years old. An interesting thing about drum is that they will eat clams and mussels, and so they will eat zebra mussels. I'm not suggesting that they necessarily are a controller of zebra mussels, but they will eat them. And what's really interesting is that they make kind of a drumming sound, particularly when they're spawning. And I've actually been on backwater habitats where you can actually hear the drumming coming from the water, and it's a very interesting experience. They're very popular with anglers. We did a creel survey on the Minnesota River a few years ago, and the most harvested species on the Minnesota River was drum. They can get up to 35 pounds, and they're a pretty cool species. They're really silver in color when they're smaller, and then they turn more of a darker color as they get older. The next group is the red horses. We have 6 species in Minnesota. We have shorthead, river, greater, golden, silver, and black. Rivers and some lakes, but you'll notice that the observations, if you notice, are kind of linear. They tend to follow in a line. Well, that's because they're primarily in river systems. This is the shorthead red horse, I believe, range distribution. They're found just about all across the state, and they're an important species in terms of reproduction and producing small offspring that are important prey items for northern pike, muskie, etc. Black red horse are one of the species that are only found in the southeastern part of the state, and those are pretty rare. They feed on invertebrates. I grew up, my introduction to fishing in northwest Minnesota was going down to the local creek or the local small river, and with my bucket of angleworms and a basic hook, and that was what I started fishing for was red horse. The greater red horse, though, can get large. They can get up to 28 inches and 12 pounds. But we do have some habitat challenges, particularly for like the river red horse. They are very they have an affinity for certain habitats, but we've got research going on to determine whether or not they're, kind of how much concern should we have. And then there's also the concern about certain species being vulnerable, like the greater red horse. They get large, and they are vulnerable to angling and bow fishing and other things. So, but the red horses are a really cool species. About half of the species have these red fins, and the other half do not. So here's a range map for you with lots and lots of dots on it, and that is the white sucker range map. There's 5 species of suckers in Minnesota. There's white, blue, spotted, longnose, and northern hog suckers. The rivers, except the whites, are also very readily found in lakes. And so, like I said, this map shows the white sucker distribution. They're found just about everywhere. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that populations are always going to be strong. We've actually been documenting a decline in white sucker populations across the state, but they are very widespread. They're a valuable bait, white suckers particularly. They are used heavily in the bait industry. They feed on invertebrates. We also have blue suckers, which are more rare, and these have a range of sizes. Northern hog suckers, for example, stay relatively small, maybe not even a pound in size, whereas, some of the others, spotteds and blues and whites can get much larger. The picture over here on the left is a longnose sucker, which are primarily found in the northeast, the Lake Superior drainage, and they're a cool species as well. The next group is carp suckers. They have a very unfortunate name, being tied to carp, because they do look a little bit more like carp than any of the other native rough fish. But these are in fact native species. There's two types. There's the river carp sucker, which is on the bottom left here. They get a little bit larger. And then there are the high fin carp suckers, which tend to be a little bit smaller. And that is a high fin carp sucker on the upper left there. Rivers, very few lakes. They are primarily a riverine species in the Mississippi, lower Mississippi, Minnesota, and the Missouri River systems. You know, this species, they will tolerate a fair amount of turbidity. They don't seem to mind the turbid conditions. But one thing that they're kind of a unicorn, so to speak, in terms of anglers. There are people who manage to catch these, but they are difficult to catch. They have a very small mouth. You have to use a very small hook generally, and they tend to be relatively spooky and finicky. So therefore, they are relatively difficult to catch. Compared to some of the other native rough fish, they are a relatively shorter lived species. And this is one that I would really like to see more research done on, because our knowledge base on carp suckers is relatively limited. The next one is called a quillback. It's very similar to the carp suckers. Um, these are found in rivers and large streams. They don't like the turbidity quite as much as the carp suckers do. They would prefer to have better water quality. Again, rarely caught by anglers, although they are relatively common, but not caught by anglers very often. They're a shorter lived species. Again, this is another one that we just don't have a lot of information on. It'd be nice to have more. They can reach 26 pounds, but that's very rare. And what I have been told by those who have tried to use them as table fare is that they have many small bones that make them somewhat challenging for consumption. Um, you can see the distribution map on these guys. They are found in a more widely across the state. They're in the same areas as the carp suckers, the lower Mississippi, the Minnesota, the Missouri River drainage, but they're also found in the red drainage, as well as the Lake of the Woods Rainy River drainage as well. The next one here is the moon eye. They prefer quiet, turbid waters. They are mostly found in river systems, lower Mississippi, Minnesota red, and the northern drainages. So they're found kind of across the state. They're surface feeders. They like to come up to the surface and feed on floating insects. That's their preferred food type. But they will eat small fish and larger invertebrates as well. Uh, the best of based on the information we have, they live up to 10 years, and they tend to stay on the smaller side, less than 12 inches and less than 1 pound in size. You can see a couple of photographs there on the left of a moon eye. You can see the name, it matches the physical characteristics. They have this large eye, which gives it its name, and they are a silver type fish. And smaller ones of these are used for bait. Those less than 7 inches are actually classified as minnows, and can be used as bait. Similar species is the goldeye. They also prefer quiet, turbid rivers, again found in the lower Mississippi, Minnesota Red River Basin. They are primarily a nocturnal species. They will stay in the shadows as best as they can during the daylight hours. Then they come out at night. They have excellent eyesight. You can see the actual gold color on the eye, and thus it's a little bit smaller eye than the moon eye. And they has an actual gold color to it, and thus the name. They oftentimes feed at the surface, and they also tend to get a little bit bigger than moon eye. It's not uncommon for these guys to get up to 20 inches and maybe even up to 2 pounds. Also live for about 10 years, and particularly in the Red River Basin, there is a harvest component there, and those fish are used for consumption, and they are smoked. One of my favorite, or probably my favorite species of the native rough fish is the bowfin. Found in slow rivers and lakes in the Mississippi. They're also commonly found in the Cannon River system. They are found in some portions of the headwaters of the southern part of the Red River system. And it's always been peculiar to me why they've never really moved out of that area, but they haven't. Um, they are found in low density. The research that we did at Bemidji State was relatively consistent, at least amongst the three lakes that we looked at. Uh, found at a much lower density than say other predator type species. They're nest builders. The males will protect the nest and the young. We found that they can live into their 30 plus year old range. The males have an eye spot on the tail, the females do not, and they eat small sunfish, crayfish, and snails. The other thing that we found is that they oftentimes have reproductive failure. They don't recruit to the population as consistently as we would maybe like them to, but because of their longevity and their low mortality, low natural mortality, they hang in there and they do quite well. I don't have a range map for the bullheads, but I think most of us probably know these guys are around. There's three species of bullheads in Minnesota: the black, the brown, and the yellow. They're found across the state, but it should be noted that in the northern latitudes, they're found in much, much lower densities. In the south, they can become very densely populated, and it's frustrating if you're trying to fish and you got a lot of small bullheads. They are bait robbers, and they'll come after your hooks. And but they have a wide range of food habits. And one thing that's interesting though is that the yellows will rarely stunt out. Oftentimes if you find a really good size structure on yellows, or on bullheads, it'll be yellows or possibly browns. Whereas if you've got a stunted population, they're almost always black. So what is happening, I guess, next for native roughish management in Minnesota? Well, we proposed some daily and possession limits this last winter, and we took public comment on those. And what we were looking at was a proposal to bring a daily and possession limit to 6 for bowfin, 5 for buffalo in the northern zone or the northern part of the state, 30 buffalo in the southern part of the state, 30 goldeye and mooneye in aggregate, 30 carp suckers and quillback in aggregate, 30 freshwater drum, and 30 suckers and red horses in aggregate. The the reasons for this are are kind of varied. Bowfin, we have good research now that shows that they are low density, inconsistently recruiting. There is some potential decline going on in populations of bowfin, and so I think we can very readily justify the daily and possession limits for bowfin. Buffalo is kind of the same thing in the north zone. We've got old populations that can't handle much harvest. Until we can verify whether or not they're reproducing, we need to be a little more protective of the buffalo in the northern part of the state. The others, we want to be protective. We want to make sure that we have a sustainable harvest. We want to make sure these populations are there for future generations to utilize. And the bag limits oftentimes establish value. When these species have unlimited bag limits, it doesn't exactly bode well for their value perception. And so we want people to understand that we do value these species in our populations. We value the importance that they bring to ecosystem services. And we also know that some of the sucker and red horse species are also declining. And we want to make sure that we are being cognizant of that. And so we have proposed these changes. Now, as part of that process, we did a public comment period this last late winter. We received 388 comments about the proposed bag limits. 47% supported the bag limits, 49% were opposed to the bag limits, and we received 86 valid requests for a hearing. What this means is that if we had more than 50 valid requests for hearing, that the rulemaking will go before an ALJ, which stands for Administrative Law Judge. And so what we are doing is we are preparing a document that will that's called a statement of need and reasonableness, that says why we think these bag limits are needed, why we think they're reasonable, and we will be presenting that to this judge. And those who are opposed to this will also have an opportunity to be a part of that hearing, and they will express why they don't feel that this is needed or reasonable. And so it'll ultimately come down to a decision by the administrative law judge on whether these things move forward or not. And we will be having that hearing at some point in 2026, but we do not know a timing on that yet, because we also are doing a hearing on the walleye bag limit, and that one we want to make sure we get done first. So that is kind of where we're at for next steps. We also have some new research that I don't have a slide for, but I just want to emphasize, we've applied for some grants to study movement of many of these species in the upper Mississippi River Basin. We are looking at advancing some additional research on red horse genetics and other. We already have ongoing work looking at the telemetry or the migrational patterns of some of these species. And so we are definitely, learning as we go here, and we are finding out some really good information. So in the end, what Minnesota DNR is trying to do is establish a future for native fish. We want to make sure, again, that we're managing these species in a sustainable way so that we are not impacting the ecosystem services that they deliver, that there will be there for future generations. And we want to emphasize that these fish have value. There are people who really, truly target these species. They enjoy these species. And we want to make sure we've got them around for a long time to come. And so with that, that concludes. My contact information is there if you wanted to reach out to me. And that concludes kind of what I had for you today, and we can open this up if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Shannon. That was great. It's always fun to hear more about our native fish, and every time I do one of these, I learn something more about some of the ages of some of these fish that we never probably haven't realized in the past, and some of the research that's been done. So why don't we jump right into some of the questions? I know there's a couple of them about the stunted. When you're talking about the bullheads, you mentioned a stunted population. Can you explain a little bit more about what a stunted population means? And then when you have a stunted population, does that mean that they're reproducing at a younger age or smaller size, or just explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. Fish populations can stunt out or become stunted if you have a couple of things. If there's not a significant amount of predation pressure, for example, to keep the numbers low, they can start to really become overpopulated. They then are competing for food. They don't grow very well. They then start reproducing at smaller and smaller sizes, and they can become very plentiful. And so there was a time when we had a lot of lakes in southern Minnesota that had what I would consider stunted black bullhead populations. Those populations have largely dissipated. I know there are still some out there, but not nearly in the numbers that there used to be. But yeah, just a lot of small size structured fish that just don't grow very well, and they stunt out.
Great. Another question: do species with greater longevity tend to reproduce at lower rates?
Well, if you think about it over the course of their lifetime, species with longevity may reproduce at lower rates, but it's not always the case. I think about longevity like with the buffalo. In the northern part of the state, where we've got buffalo populations that have had many, many decades in some cases of recruitment and reproductive failure, yes, then those fish have definitely they're going to hopefully hit at some point in their longevity of their long life cycle. But we have buffalo in southern parts of the state that reproduce, every year. But in general, if you think about animals overall, the the longer lived species tend to reproduce in smaller quantities or not necessarily every year. And so they reproduce less over the course of their lifetime, yes.
Is it true also, like, I think sturgeon, they don't reproduce until they're significantly older, 18, 20 years or something like that. Is that typical too when fish live longer?
If they are a long-lived species, it oftentimes does follow through that they don't start reproducing until later, till later years, or at least longer. Um, but like with the bowfin, they're in their 30s. We are anticipating that they are still reproducing by probably age 4, which isn't too bad. But there again, inconsistent recruitment, nest failure. We're not really sure what's going on with some of that, but they don't reproduce every year or
Right.
successfully reproduce every year. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Sounds good. Thanks. There's another one about, you were talking about the new possession and daily limits, and you had a couple species that were listed as in aggregate. What was the meaning behind that and the reasoning?
Sure, the in aggregate just simply means like for buffalo, we don't have a limit for big mouth buffalo and a separate limit for smallmouth buffalo and a separate limit for black buffalo. And largely it's because we have to be cognizant of the fact that in some cases, particularly with like the red horses, I know there's interest out there that people would really like to see, like greater red horse have their own limit. But the problem is that even our own staff in some cases can't tell the red horses apart. And so would it be fair for us to put a limit on red horse and expect the public to be able to tell them apart? And so we do the in aggregate where we think species look at similarly enough that we aren't, so like with the quillbacks and the carp suckers, I don't expect the average person to know how to separate those. Doesn't mean they couldn't, but I don't expect them to.
Yeah, I would agree. I get asked some of that stuff at the state fair, and I'm like, I have to double check and look and think on some of those species too, because they are confusing, especially when you're seeing them at a distance in a pond. So
Yeah.
somebody asked, you don't think there should be any size limitations on fish possible to be possessed? Like, we have size limits in a lot of other fish. So
I don't think we have any definitive information that would warrant us to go to a size limit on any of these species. Um, you know, Part of the challenge is that with the bag limits, we are looking at bow fishermen, for example, and we don't want to, we don't. I mean, it's very difficult to decide. It's like, okay, so let's say we set a size limit on something at 20 inches. Are they going to be able to differentiate a 19-inch from a 21-inch fish? And is that really significant enough of an issue uh, to to warrant trying to push that forward? And at this point, we just don't believe it is.
great. And somebody from up in Otter Tail County um, heard about burbot being pretty prevalent when ice fishing. Obviously, there's like ice fishing festival, or used to be around burbot up north. They're asking if there's any other specific native rough fish that you find during ice fishing season.
You know, that's part of why we took the species, the burbot, the lake whitefish, and the cisco, and moved them to game fish because we were seeing a significant winter harvest for these species, and we wanted to get some limits on those and make sure that we were managing those a little bit more sustainably. As far as the other native rough fish go, I do hear of the occasional one being the occasional bowfin being caught through the ice. I know there are people who catch freshwater drum through the ice. I've heard of the occasional white sucker being caught through the ice, so there are some, but the native rough fish, I mean, in reality, that they're being primarily targeted in open water. So
Yeah, burbot are one of those really rare species too that they mate like in March, right? Early in the
they
year, still in
do.
the ice.
Yep, they spawn under the ice anywhere from late February to mid March. and that's when they're a really popular uh, ice ice angling target.
Is somebody after your calendar, Shannon? Is there a way to purchase the native fish calendars? I don't know if we have any
Um,
left.
we don't have very many left for 2026. We don't sell them; we just give them away. So they are. We will be having the 2027s available probably by August. At least that's the plan. And so come see us at the state fair or drop me a note and we can get you one. Just let us know. But just one quick story about the calendars. You know, we've got these calendars that are focused on these amazing native fish species, and we had a gentleman at the state fair that came up to us and said, "I can't believe you did a whole calendar on carp." Just, just to give people an idea that there's still a lot of education that's needed out there to get people to understand that these native rough fish species are not carp and they don't behave like carp. So,
It kind of leads into another question we have in our educational materials, like our calendar. How important do you think it is to list the common nicknames of some of the native rough fish in addition to the more formal names?
well, I think it's important to get the common names out there, but what I'm trying to do, like I didn't mention, that bowfin are most people who don't know the term bowfin, if you tell them, well, it's a dogfish, then they know what you're talking about, you know. But what I would like to do is I would like to educate the public a little bit and say, these are bowfin. That's what they're called, you know. And it's same way with freshwater drum, I mean, they're freshwater drum. I mean, that's what they are. And same way with Cisco. I don't generally find myself using the term Tulabee very much, but Tulabee and Cisco are one and the same. And so I think it's important, but I also feel that these fish deserve to be called by their actual names too.
I would agree. I caught a lot of sheephead back in the day, but never heard of a freshwater drum until I was older.
Yep,
So,
yep,
so my grandpa always called them. So,
yep.
let's see here. Are there limitations of using native rough fish for bait or spearing decoys?
Um, not not particularly. The suckers, for example, and the red horses, they all the catastomids, which is catastomidae is the family name for all of the suckers, red horses, buffaloes. Anything less than 12 inches in those groups are considered minnows in the state of Minnesota. And you can use a larger one for bait. Like the catfish anglers will go out and they'll catch red horse or suckers and they'll cut them up or drum and they'll use them for cut bait. And then you can also use large suckers for on a sucker harness, or you can use it for a decoy. Yeah, those are legitimate uses for the species.
Yeah. We have one here also. Is there any locations in Minnesota that a citizen would be able to discover a pile of carp dumped out to dry on a shoreline? I've seen this in a specific location in a number of consecutive years, and I always thought it was not a proper thing. What recommendations do you have for this person to either report it, or is there, people that are out there catching
Yeah.
carp for management issues and dumping them?
Unfortunately, we see a fair amount of dumping of carp and native rough fish as far as that goes. And I just want to emphasize to the listeners that it is against the law. You are not allowed to dump those fish on any shoreline or any boat landing. You can't go dump them in a public ditch, I mean, so there's lots of rules about how those fish can be disposed of. If you run into a consistent issue where you've got people dumping fish, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to your local conservation officer. Let them know what you're seeing, where you're seeing it at, and they can potentially follow up on that.
That's kind of what I was thinking too. Reach out to the local CO, take a couple pictures, send them a GPS
Yep.
location of it, and let them follow up. So, somebody's asking if you know what the origin of calling them red horse is.
I don't probably have a great answer for that, but I know that the red comes from the coloration of the fins on several of the species. And but that's a good question. I've never been asked that one before. And so I would have to probably do a little research on that one myself. So, but I know the red comes from the coloration of the fins on at least 3 of the species. And there's red horse species all across the country, other than the 6 that we have here. So,
Somebody else was asking, why aren't commercial fishing limits being controlled if you're setting limits for personal use?
well, that's a great question. Um, Part of it is that the commercial fishing permits, we only allow those in certain areas where we know the fish can handle harvest at that level. And so we want to ensure that there's some sustainability for the anglers. And so part of it is the potential for use. So for example, if you have if you or I are going out and we're catching bigmouth buffalo and we have, what are we going to really do with 30, 40-pound bigmouth buffalo? You know, um, Whereas the commercial harvesters have a market for those fish. And so those fish don't go to waste. They are, trucked out to the East Coast. They're used in various industries. So I think a lot of it has to do with the potential for use. Um, Individuals just can't use that many, whereas commercial fishermen can. So
I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but the it's not like just anybody can get a commercial fishing license and it's an unlimited number of fish. It's usually you got maybe a poundage limit or something per year, and there's a few people that do it. It's not
yeah,
anybody can
there's
get one.
not there's not a lot for necessarily strict limits. The limiting factor is what the market demands, and the market demands have not been stellar. Let's put it that way. But yes, you're right that it is a limited number of people. The commercial anglers or commercial fishers have to apply to have like a given commercial area, and they're the only one that's primarily working that area. And so you're right, it is a limited number.
And then one more, they saw the commercial fishing one. What commercial fishing in Minnesota? Where and for what do they fish for?
The commercial fishing in Minnesota is primarily limited to native rough and carp. Um, and we have commercial fishers across the entire state or large portions of the state. They are probably more so concentrated in the southern and central parts of the state and the Mississippi River Valley. They harvest a lot of buffalo. They harvest carp when there's a market for carp. They harvest a few drum. They harvest other species as well. And the other one that the commercial fishers go after is the right size bullhead for bullhead feeds and bullhead festivals and things of that nature. But they've been struggling, as far as from what I have been told, anyways. They're struggling to find the right size of bullheads for that purpose. And so they're always on the lookout for good sized bullheads for bullhead feeds. So
Interesting. These niche industries you don't think about all the time. So thank you for sharing all that.
yep.
Just a couple reminders. We're just about out of time. Um, but I did want to remind everybody it is Earth Day today, so happy Earth Day to everybody. It's also a beautiful day in springtime Minnesota. I think it was close to mid 70s outside, which is fantastic for this time of year. It also, I want to remind everybody, it's Free Park Day coming up on Saturday here. So if you want to get out and celebrate Earth Day or visit a state park, it is free this weekend. Get out and do that. It looks like it's going to be a pretty decent weekend to do that. And of course, fishing for our native rough-fish is open in Minnesota. You can get out and do a little fishing while you're out there, which is always good. I did want to warn everybody too, it is a red flag warning in Minnesota here for the next few days. It has been pretty dry this spring, so if you are out and about, please watch the wildfire risk and everything else. Keep your eyes in the sky and be safe out there. So next week, we are talking about the fishing opener that is coming up pretty fast, or 2 weeks, excuse me, the 6th of May. It'll be our 237th episode. So join us. Some of the walleye or some of the fishery staff are going to join us and just talk about the fishing opener. So I think until then, thanks everybody for joining us. Shannon, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and passion on native fish in Minnesota. And I see we got one more question in there talking about native fish in Minnesota. Just wondering when we'll move beyond the rough part and just concentrate on expanding our focus on native fish across the state.
Yep.
So if you want to have the
Well,
last word.
yeah, I would have loved to have taken the rough part out of the fish definition, but at the time when we were making the change, there just wasn't a legislative appetite to do so. And so there was still a desire to separate game fish from other fish. And so the rough unfortunately stuck. But at least we got native rough fish now instead of rough fish, and it does not include carp. So,
And thank you for all your work on that, along with all the other people that are involved in that and the other organizations. It's a tremendous lift, and I think it's going to benefit us in the future. And I will say it again on the show: we have probably one of the best and most spectacular fisheries in all of the United States, and people come from all over to fish this. I actually have a good friend that moved here from Montana because they got sick of trout and they want to fish toothy creatures. So they're here to chase northerns and muskies and stuff like that. So, I mean, we have a pretty special fisheries in Minnesota. So hopefully all of you can get out and enjoy it. And thank you to Shannon and all the fishery staff and all the fishing organizations in Minnesota for sharing their passion and knowledge and doing what you do to conserve our waters and our fish. So,
yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
you bet. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in a couple of weeks for the fishing opener. Um, go outside, enjoy the weekend, enjoy Earth Day, enjoy Free Park Day. Be safe out there, and we will see you next time.